and Sing Jazz Show. My guests today are three extraordinary guitarists, Greg Skaff, Peter Bernstein, and Bob Sneider. Greg Skaff, a native of Wichita, Kansas, picked up the guitar at age 16 after becoming enthralled by George Benson's It's Uptown album. He studied jazz at Wichita State for 3 semesters, but his real passion was performing jazz, blues, and rock in Wichita clubs. Greg's first professional job was a 5-year stay in the band of saxophone giant Stanley Turrentine, and he has flourished as a first-call sideman in New York City since the 1980s. He's performed or recorded with Freddie Hubbard, David Fathead Newman, Ron Carter, David Hazeltine, Mike Ladon, Victor Lewis, Gloria Lynn, Jim Rotundi, and Bobby Watson. Greg has worked at such notable clubs as Small Jazz Club, Mesro, the Bar Next Door, the 55 Bar, the Iridian, I believe all in Manhattan, as well as the Artist Quarter in St. Paul and at the Umbria Jazz Festival in Italy. Greg's 5 feature albums have been well received by jazz fans everywhere. The latest is Soulmation, his 5th overall and 4th consecutive release on the high-profile Soho music label. Excuse me. Peter Bernstein was born in New York City in 1967 and began playing piano when he was 8, but switched to guitar when he was 13, learning the instrument primarily by ear. He studied jazz at Rutgers University with Ted Dunbar and Kenny Barron. He released his first album as a leader with pianist Brad Mehldau and has participated in over 80 recordings and numerous festival, concert, and club performances, and as a leader has released a dozen albums and a DVD, Live at Smoke. Peter attended the New School when he met the legendary guitarist Jim Hall, who asked him to participate in the Invitational Concert as part of the 1990 JVC Jazz Festival, along with John Schofield and Pat Metheny. Hall noted that Peter had paid attention to the past as well as the future and stated he was the most impressive guitarist he had heard. In 1990, Peter began working with alto saxophonist Lou Donaldson and took part in the first of 4 recordings with him. Peter has also worked with drummer Jimmy Cobb, as well as organist Larry Goldens, drummer Bill Stewart as an organ trio, Diana Krall, Dr. Lonnie Smith, Nicholas Payton, Sonny Rollins, Lee Konitz, Tom Harold, and Eric Alexander. Peter is often seen performing at Small Jazz Club in Mesro in the heart of New York City. Bob Sneider, born in Brockton, Massachusetts, toured for several years with 2-time Grammy Award winner Chuck Mangione. Bob has performed or recorded with Nat Adderley, Houston Pearson, Joe Locke, Don Menza, Lou Donaldson, Joey DeFrancesco, Pat Bianchi, Pat LaBarbera, Grant Stewart, Ken Poplowski, Jerry Nywood, Chris Potter, Roy McCurdy. He's lived in Rochester, like right next door to me. Eric Alexander, Dave Hazeltine, Frank Strazzeri, John Faddis, and has had frequent appearances with the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra Pops. Bob has performed in major jazz clubs, festivals, and concert halls throughout South America, Central America, North America, and Europe. Bob is a graduate of the University of Rochester, where he studied with Bill Dobbins and Raymond Rickert. Growing up in Brockton, MA, Bob's mentor and teacher was Chet Crewley. Chet Crewley was a veteran of the Fletcher Henderson and Nat Pierce bands. In 1997, Bob joined the Eastman faculty. Hold on one second while I get these cats online. Hey guys, how are you? Thanks for making it. Hey,
Sure.
my first question is for Bob. Bob, could you tell me about your mentor and teacher, Chet Crewley? Besides performing with Fletcher Henderson and Nat Pierce bands, Chet performed with Anita O'Day, Robert Goulet, Frank Sinatra, Sid Caesar, Tony Bennett, Bob Hope, Rich Little, Perry Como, Jimmy Lunsford, and Jackie Gleason, and later he taught at the Berklee School of Music. Anyway, what kind of impression did Chet as a mentor leave you with, and did he have any funny stories or advice?
Oh, yeah. Well, he was an amazing teacher. I started studying with him when I was 6 years old, and I played a little half-size nylon string guitar. And then we just went through just, basic method book technique kinds of things and reading. And he always made it so much fun. Even as a little kid, it's like every lesson there'd be something fun, like learn a TV show theme, theme from Batman, Gilligan's Islands, all kinds of stuff. And then, he started teaching me pop tunes, and then he endured several years of teaching me heavy metal tunes. But he still made me do mechanics and reading and chord building. And then I asked him about jazz when I got into middle school, and then he just sort of unloaded on me. And every week there'd be a new LP that he put in my hands, and then he started telling me stories about his musical youth in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Some of the people that he grew up with in Cambridge, Mass, which is right next door to Boston. And then he told me some of his friends that he grew up with, Roy Haynes, and they eventually played together in different groups, and different other kids that were from that area. They were kids at the time. There's a pianist, Richard Twardzik. He wound up working with Chet Baker, among other people. And then Serge Chaloff, a whole bunch of people. And great trumpet player Joe Gordon grew up right near his neighborhood. So yeah, he was amazing. He just made it so much fun. But he was so humble. He wasn't a name dropper. But occasionally he would just say, he'd tell me stories about being on the road with Fletcher Henderson. He was the only white guy in the band. And he said it was when they would play down in southern states, he used to have to disguise himself, because if the police saw somebody that was sympathizing or hanging out or working with people of color, that was egregious. And then when they were in northern states where there would still be some racism, he would pose as Fletcher's driver. Yeah.
I was also interested in that he worked with Sid Caesar and Jackie Gleason. Did he ever talk to you about working? I got to work with Don Rickles, which was a really cool thing. Don, I told him a little story. I went up, Don, I said, as a kid, me and my family used to listen to you on Johnny Carson, but if we went out to dinner, we would take a TAC recorder and record you and come back and listen to you then. And it was our favorite thing to do. And he went like this: I hate this, except from Don. He went, "You're a good kid." And he shook my cheek, and I said, wow, Don Rickles. Did he ever speak about non-musical gigs, which are really important to musicians, younger cats? You have to learn how to read, or just about the whole reading thing?
No. I mean, he would tell me funny stories. He would also tell me about pop gigs that he ended up doing early in her career. The famous disco singer Donna Summer,
right?
She's from the Boston area, so he did a lot of her early work. And
he was talking about heavy metal. Who is that? Like Iron Man and that kind of.
Oh yeah. He would show me Black Sabbath tunes.
Wow.
Whatever it was, he would just people whatever they wanted to learn. And then I think he was just holding out hope that there'd be some jazz gems in his population of students. And and he was inspiring.
That's amazing to go from Fletcher Henderson to Black Sabbath. I want to ask Peter about working with Sonny Rollins, Tom Harold, and Lou Donaldson.
Yeah,
I mean that's no mean feat. Out of those three musicians, Peter, which would you say you learned the most from, and what was it that you learned?
Well, I can't really compare. Each situation was so different besides the music, but also the Tom Harrell, I basically did like a couple of little tours with when he had this band, playing Brazilian music. He wrote all these beautiful originals, and he had the real cats, Dom Salvador, and of course Dennis Irwin played bass, and Duca de Fonseca was like guys that really knew that music. And Tom's beautiful song. So as a guitar player, I was just trying to get a little bit with the Brazilian flavor, but Lou Donaldson, I worked when I was pretty young. My first gig, my first time really playing with the organ, a real organ player, Dr. Lonnie Smith.
Whoa.
And that was just some recordings and very different type of experience. Lou is incredible. I played with him for many years, did some recordings, and he was amazing. Lonnie Smith. I learned so much about consistency with those guys. And of course, Tom Harrell too, like just how much they are themselves all the time. Every time they play, they get to them, right away. And of course, Sonny Rollins was another level in terms of, jazz heroes for me, like one of the inventors of language, really. And so to get to play with him was amazing. I mean, he was just audacious playing. And the deepest thing I learned from Sonny, I would have to say, and this applies, I learned this lesson in different ways from all the other guys, but just like the privilege of being an improviser, being able to, make up your own notes and make up your own phrasing and work to get your own sound. Sonny put it one time, like in a drummer was asking him, should I play on this particular, it was a calypso number. He said, should I play with the snare drum open or closed? Should it be, what's the right way to do it? The authentic way. Sonny was quiet for about 20 seconds, and then he finally said, like, that's up to you. If the music is feeling good, you're here to make decisions. And it's up to you what to do. And if you think about it, you couldn't be in a more privileged position.
Yeah.
Those words he said exactly. And the rest I've kind of just like, it was just like, yeah. He said something about symphony orchestras are full of musicians, great musicians that have to follow the conductor and play the notes in front of them. We have such a freedom to be able to improvise. And that was the lesson up until that point. I mean, I never thought about it strictly in those terms. I was always trying to like learn how to play and play the hip stuff and be right for the situation, get my own thing, but never really understanding the the distinction of just being able to improvise and what a privilege it is. And with that, freedom and privilege comes responsibility. You have to play for the music. You have to know and have a feeling about the songs you're playing or the groove you're playing, whatever it is you're level. With that in mind of like, I'm going to exercise my freedom to be creative, be myself. All those guys exemplify that in their own way.
Yeah. Hey, Peter, I'm going to ask you to do something. Go back to system preferences.
Oh, you can't hear me at all.
No, I hear you fine, but that's the problem. Turn it back to 85 instead of 100 and just and get a little closer to the so in other words, right. I think that's some of the sound that I'm getting, and I don't know if other people are getting it, but
how's that?
It's the same. We're getting it's, I guess it's something, if people that are live, if you hear the sound and the sound's fine, just let me know. Jim Coleman, Sadi. Okay, good.
I'm at 83%.
Yeah, that's good. We're still getting some kind of sound, but I can't tell where it's from. But we'll leave it as is. Greg,
I was hearing some noise too, but I didn't know what it was.
Yeah, I don't know if it's coming from an electrical cords being too close, or sometimes it could be lamps or something like that. But not to worry. But those stories about Sonny Rollins are just enthralling. I was going to meet Sonny with a friend of mine, Philip Turman. We were going to drive up to see Sonny, which is a great story in itself. Sonny wants some work done on his teeth, and Philip used to run the whole internship in Columbia University on the 8th floor, uptown. And I wanted to ask Sonny something about the way he improvised. There are guys like avant-garde players or Art Farmer or Chet Baker, and you didn't really hear lines that you thought they practiced, But if you listen to Sonny play Woody and you, what is it? Ba-bee, ba-da-da, ba-bee, da-da-da. You could hear you could hear him playing stuff in different keys that obviously had worked out because it was repeated like a step lower or something. And I want to ask him, how much of that did he work out, or how much of that was just, he was also, somebody said he used to rehearse when he rehearsed with cats, and you could verify this, he would put a chart up. It was Lou Ornstein, the tenor player. And he said he would put a chart up in front of the cats, and not even a chart. He would just start playing a song with no chart. And once they got the chords and understood the tune, he would rip it to pieces. Did Sonny did Sonny put charts out in front of you? Or?
He had a couple of pieces of music in his hand that he would write, and sometimes it would just changes. Sometimes it was a tune written out. But it wasn't a lot of reading. It was his tunes were like, he had a couple that were kind of, one that was for J.J. Johnson that was kind of a long form, but otherwise they were very kind of vamp based. The calypso, but it was a song form with a bridge or something, and he played some standards, and he played a lot of open stuff, kind of vamp stuff. It wasn't a reading gig at all, and he was liable to play anything. Once we went out at an encore, some concert in France, that he just, without saying anything, he went into "Isn't She Lovely" in E, which maybe is a key, I'm sure. But luckily, I was like, I know this is Stevie Wonder. He started playing it, and then Cranshaw, of course, he's on top of everything. So I did a little test with an open string with the guitar to my ear. I said, wow, he's an E major. So luckily, but he would do stuff, and he would play standards. They Say It's Wonderful, and just launch into him, and
Was Cranshaw on electric or on upright at that time?
First he was on electric. Then he got this kind of upright David Gage.
Yeah. He sounded great on anything. There was another cat I remembered, you probably don't know, from Queens, Eddie Thompson, who used to play with Wes Bellcat. Yeah. He played a fretless bass, guitar. But man, it sounded great.
Concept, Cranshaw just.
It's the concept,
it's the groove.
Some guys can do that.
Connecting the roots, that's his whole thing. And he was such a, he was just like, I'm here to serve the music. That's his whole. He didn't want a solo. He would take one, but he was just kind of like all about that, all about the groove, laying it down.
Yeah.
They played together for 50 years. Incredible.
Oh, Sonny and Cranshaw played for 50 years?
Yeah, 50 years. Yeah, more.
Woo.
Playing, I think they played in 59, 58, 59. Yeah, something like that.
59, I've been listening to Night at the Village Vanguard, Sonny's, the double record. I think that was in 59. It's
with Wilbur Ware, you mean?
Yeah, Wilbur Ware, and there's another bass player, I forget.
Henry Grimes is on a couple tunes, I think, right? That's 57, I think. But anyway, Cranshaw came along after that. Definitely by 60, they were playing together. So
wow.
That's 50 years, more than 50 years they played together. So
that's history. Greg, I want to ask Greg something. Greg worked with one of my favorite saxophone players also, who was like very funky. There were guys who...
Stanley?
Yeah, I knew Harold Vick, and I knew guys that played like that, Harold Osley, some certain guys, but Stanley was like the epitome of that kind of cat who could play soulful. And yet, if he did like a bebop song or something, he would just tear it to pieces. It wasn't just that he was funky. It was like it was very similar to a guitar player I like, Grant Green, who could blow through changes and yet was so funky. What was it like working with Stanley Turrentine?
Well, Stanley. Oh yeah, you were just talking about how he could play bebop tunes. It seemed like
whatever you wanted to say about Stanley would be welcome. Don't stick to my question.
Kind of his approach, even on any kind of pop tunes or funk tunes that we played too.
Come a little closer to the computer so I can hear you, Greg.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Stanley just basically had the same approach no matter what the context. He was playing bebop all over those pop and funk tunes and R&B tunes too. Yeah. You got to remember he was playing with Max Roach with his brother Tommy.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything else you could tell us about Stanley that impressed you? Did a lot of times you don't get close to the actual cat when you work with him.
Well, we traveled quite a bit in those days, so I mean, I've spent the night at his house in the basement there. I mean, I knew Stanley, maybe not as much as some people, but yeah, I knew him. But musically, the thing that impressed me about Stanley was where he put the time, or there's kind of certain kind of phrasing he played.
Yeah, it was very different.
You can hear it just on Sugar. You can hear it really where he plays the melody on Sugar. It's kind of subtle, and you might not notice it until you hear someone else play the same song, and to compare. I don't know. It was great just being able to play those melodies with him, because a lot of times I'd be doubling the melody with him.
Wow. Yeah, that's a hard, those kind of players, that's lost in school. You could copy somewhat Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane, but guys like Stanley and Coleman Hawkins and Earl Bostic and Gene Ammons and Harry Sweets Edison and Cootie Williams. I mean, it's just so remarkable, the personality that was in Stanley's sound and the guys I just mentioned. And that's something that you just can't teach. And it seems to be lost. And I've talked about this before, not that the younger cats can't play. They can, and they're coming up with new ideas. It's remarkable. Yeah. So but still, I kind of miss that personality, not only in their playing, but the way they lived. Like when I hung with Philly Joe Jones or Woody Shaw, you couldn't see 5 minutes in front what they were going to play or what they were going to do. It was just like a whole different type of living. So very exciting. So it's nice that you guys got to play with those cats. I'm going to move on to Bob. I have a funny story about Chuck Mangione. And I played in front of thousands of people in Japan with my own band and with Sinatra in Atlantic City, and I wasn't nervous at all. But I remember one of the first solos I ever played was in front of someone that mattered as a listener, and that was Chuck. Anyways, I was so nervous, the horn was shaking, and I was playing the best I could under the circumstances. I was about 16 years old, I guess. And I remember after the performance, Chuck came up to me and he told me to calm down. So not just Chuck, but you worked with one of my favorite trumpet players besides Chuck. So this is like a double question. You worked with Nat Adderley. So could you speak about Chuck a little and also about Nat for me, both of them? And I'm sure that you traveled a lot more with Chuck, so you have some stories there.
Yeah, I really only did about 4 weeks with Nat, and it was kind of through my association with Chuck. And that was a really interesting time. When I first started working with Chuck, he was playing like more out of his Riverside bebop repertoire, and then there'd be maybe one of his pop tunes at the end of the night, and then but then eventually it went more into the classics, bigger concerts with orchestras, places all over the world. But when I first started doing the gig, it was really his bebop roots. I still remember when I auditioned for him. I purposely called a tune off of one of his Riverside records, and he said, "Is there a ballad you want to play?" And I said, "Yeah, how about I Had the Craziest Dream from that's one of my favorite tunes." And I knew he recorded it, so I figured that maybe he'll be into it. And he kind of had this look of surprise, like, "Wow, I haven't played that one in a long time." But he played it like it had been, on his music stand for a long time. It was a lot of fun. It was a steep learning curve. But the one thing that I try to tell my students is that there's a big difference between a professional, boring job and being a college student. And I started working with him right out of college. And what you think you need to do when you prepare in college is nothing like when you're trying to prepare somebody's book for a touring gig, especially if it's a book that should all be up here and in here. And it took me quite a while to not screw up a lot. And so I wasn't playing a trumpet, but I know that shaking feeling of
Oh boy.
not trying to take off the man in the hat. But eventually it got better and better. Probably one of the scariest Chuck gigs I ever played is when I knew Peter Bernstein was coming to hang out at the Blue Note one night. Yeah, so I was a little nervous, but anyways, but yeah, it was a lot of fun, and it was a great learning experience. And one of the differences about being, a college student, and then actually developing a sense of stage presence and knowing how to shape solos, understanding how to phrase with a band. When you've had a conductor tell you how to do all that stuff throughout school, and then you're like, oh, I'm just expected to do that automatically. And it took me a while, but it got better. Yeah. So my association with Nat came about through Chuck, and put together this huge, like, all around Western New York sort of mini traveling festival, and he had different groups playing all around. He was trying to get that whole Western New York circuit and Central New York circuit going again. So we would do a week in Rochester, a week in Buffalo, a week in Syracuse, and then split a week between Rome and Utica. And
where would you play for a week in those places?
Yeah,
There were clubs you would play at for a week.
Yeah, play for a week. And there were some other groups that went out. There were a couple of weeks during that time. I went out and we did a band with my brother and Chris Potter, Mike Melito, and bassist Paul LaDuca, and yeah, it was a lot of fun. And James Moody was also on that same circuit, and then it was just awesome.
Say, Bob, let me ask you, who was on the Riverside album of Chuck's? Who was on that?
Oh man, depending on which one it was, because he did like 3 of them. I think the one I'm thinking of is the one that Wynton Kelly, Sam Jones, and Jimmy Cobb, I think.
Yeah, because I have one of those, and it's really remarkable. And I think there was a saxophone player on one.
Yeah, probably would have been Sal Nistico's on one.
Yeah, that's the one I had. That Sal was a running friend of mine, by the way. Hey, also, Bob, you worked with Peter in Rochester, is that correct?
Oh yeah.
Tell me about that, and then I'll.
Yeah. Well, Peter's come to Rochester a bunch of times, and I had Peter come, I think, at least once or twice to when I used to do all the music at the Strathallan.
Yes.
And that was a good time. And then had him over to Eastman to do a workshop, and then I brought him in another time, and we did a small concert for the students. And Peter did a workshop for the students as well, in addition to the concert. And I know the bass player really well because it was your brother Danny.
Yeah.
And it was our good buddy Mike Melito on drums. So it was really cool that John Nugent, the director of the Rochester Jazz Festival, came to that little informal gig, and then he booked us on the Jazz Fest. And Peter called us the Band of Brothers because he worked with all of our brothers.
Well, I knew all your brothers first.
Yeah. I know, yeah.
Incredible. I want to ask Peter something about the whole sound, and I'm familiar with trumpets and how the sound, and a little about saxophones. My brother Johnny plays saxophone, and how Coltrane might use a mouthpiece that's a 5, and Sonny might use one that's an 8. And the bigger, I believe, the bigger the size, the bigger the sound in general. But I think there's and this is more stuff I get online. There's two major brands of guitar, the Gibson and the Fender, like there's three major bicycle companies, Giant, Trek, and Specialized. The guitars, electric guitars, are hollowed body, and some are thinner than thicker than others, and each one gets a special sound. But all three of you get beautiful round sounds, which is why I asked the three of you to do this live stream. I was wondering, Peter, what equipment regarding your guitar, your pickup, and your strings do you use to get that beautiful sound?
Well,
a lot of it is you.
But a lot of it is that I have a really good instrument. I have this amazing guitar made by a luthier, the late John Zeidler, and this was a guitar he made in 1981. So it's getting on 40 years old now, this guitar. But I've had it about 20, and I got it back in the late 90s, and just the type of animal that is like what they call a hollow body arch top, and the pickup is not cut in, so the pickup is floating, which means it's more of an acoustic sound. It's pretty loud without being plugged in. So it's that kind of thing, but it's also has a full humbucker, so it can I can play it relatively loud, and it's just a very well made instrument. It's just has a lot of sustain, and when I got it, I really just felt like, wow, this guitar is really telling me how I play. You know, whatever I play, if I'm convinced with what I'm playing, it will sound that way. If I'm not sure, it will very much sound unsure. So it was a very good instrument for me to get to improve my control and my touch, to get to play up to its level, which I'm still trying to do. I think any instrument has to do with like resistance, and the same thing with mouthpieces and reeds and all that. How hard do you want to blow to get a certain sound? Same thing with the guitar. How tight the strings are. Heavier strings are harder to play, but to a certain degree, in thicker sound, you can play them harder. So you're all balancing how you want the guitar to ring with the resistance of what's coming back at you when you tap or touch the instrument. Hopefully that attacks.
Speaking of the strings, do you like a bass uses gut strings or steel strings? I know Ari Rowan uses gut strings, and you'll lower them and it'll make it easier, but you won't get as big a sound. With the guitar, I think there's nylon and steel strings. Is that correct? Or
well, electric guitars will use steel strings because nylon won't amplify, won't be picked up.
Of course, yeah.
Pickup. But it's the same principle with the action of a bass, the action of a guitar. How tight are the strings? How hard are you pushing to get sound? And it's just what's coming back at you in terms of the tension that determines your touch and how you.
And there's no bridge to lower or make the strings higher like on a bass. Is that correct?
There's many hollow bodies or even semi-hollows. You can adjust the action. Of course, these are adjustable things to the preference of the player.
And what kind of pickup are you using, by the way?
I have a humbucker, Gibson humbucker, that's placed on top of this.
And did you? I thought I read on Facebook. Did you get back a guitar that was stolen that was very important to you? Is that the guitar you're talking about? Was a guitar taken when you were flying? Or was a guitar stolen?
No.
Thank God. Yeah, I thought I had read something about that during.
No, I mean maybe guitar players post various battles with airlines because it's our only thing we can do to offend the corporation that offended us by giving us a hard time about traveling with it. Call them out, like Asiana Airlines. So there's that. Guitar players deal with that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Or we used to anyway.
Like there's not enough anxiety with flying anyway. Yeah,
Right. That's always the most stressful part of the day on the road. It's just like, okay, got to get on a plane with the guitar. Let's focus all positive thoughts and energy towards this moment. After that, but those were our old problems. Like I kind of that's the people thing. Yeah. I want those problems.
Which brings me to a question for Greg. During this coronavirus, as you practice changing, like. For me, as a trumpet player, I was talking to Grant Stewart. He says he could lay off for 3 weeks and it won't hurt him. But I practice every day, and fortunately, I enjoy practicing. Go figure. But sometimes I don't warm up anymore. I get right to practicing tunes or a pattern that I want to. I get to the fun stuff first, and I don't have to worry about playing lead or split leads. So my warm up doesn't have to be as intensive. Is your during these coronavirus lockdown times? Is your practicing your routine changed in any way, Greg?
Not only in the sense that I like it more because I don't have to think about having to only a certain amount of time. I can kind of get lost in the music without thinking, oh, I've got to leave at such and such a time. I don't have anywhere to go now.
That is nice.
Yeah.
And also about your equipment, the same question that I was asking, you know, I'm curious, the younger guitar players want to know about your equipment and what you're using. And certainly the equipment doesn't make the player. But if I took my mouthpiece off of my trumpet and tried to play it without a mouthpiece, that would prove how important the equipment is. So speak about your equipment a little, please.
My go-to guitar is a Gibson Birdland.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing it just works for me. It's not too big. It's not little. It's hollow. I like a hollow box. One modification I made was most guitars like this have a tune-o-matic bridge, but I had a wooden bridge saddle made by a guy named Flip Scipio. And man, he just made just this piece of art. It's probably hard to see, but it's so beautiful, and it sounds good. It's real. It did what I wanted it to do. It's I don't know, for lack of a better word, it's more I can hear more of the wood. I feel like, and you know, I don't have the compensated. I can't adjust the tuning like on a tune-o-matic, but he made it so it's pretty close. Yeah, really. So, what else were you talking about? Strings?
Well, do you have, yes, the strings, what kind of strings and pickup are you using? And then I'll ask Bob the same question so I don't forget.
I didn't change the pickups on this guitar, so I guess they're stock Gibson pickups. I like the way they sound. Strings, I always use Tomastic strings. Either 12 or 13 gauge. I don't know. I just like that gauge.
Do you have different guitars for different settings? Like if you want to play in a little more louder room, or
yeah, in a louder room, I use a 335, just because it's got a block and it won't feed back. But sometimes I'm afraid this will feed back on a bigger stage or with a loud group, with an organ group.
Yeah. And Bob, the same question?
Sure. Yeah. Well, for the longest time, I played a Gibson Johnny Smith, which is
nice.
a huge arch top, 17-inch body guitar, like really, really thick, totally hollow. Just like Peter's guitar, it had a floating pickup. But Johnny Smith, who helped design the guitar, which was originally put out by the Guild Guitar Corporation, and then it was put out by Gibson. Instead of a full humbucker like Peter has, it actually has a mini humbucker. But that guitar had a great sound, but over the years I started to develop some issues with like neck and shoulder types of things, and as much as I loved that guitar, just the physical weight of it made it tricky for me to keep playing it, and I developed a weird nerve thing where my left arm went dead for like, I think it was around 3 months. It was one of the scariest things in my life. You know, my fingers would move, so I still remember playing a gig with a rhythm section, and then a great guitar player, Randy Napoleon, and the whole night my left hand was on top of my lap, and I'm trying to keep up with Randy, and Mike Carn was playing bass, and Mike Melito was on drums. It was the music felt great, but I felt like, oh my gosh, this I've got to make some changes and, take better care of my health. And then one of the things I decided to do was, to do this without hurting myself, was to explore, a thinner instrument, but something that's totally hollow. So you notice that the depth is about 1 3/4 inches, but it's totally hollow. The maker, am I getting my camera here? No relation to the school. It's Eastman Guitars.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the local shop owners here in Rochester, John Bernunzio, helped to get me an endorsement with them. And this guitar it's so light. It's really easy to play, and I like to have my action up because I've never been a fan of super low, slinky kinds of strings. I don't use heavy gauge like I used to. I used to use 13s. I used to play flat wound strings. And then I remember when the first time I met Peter, and I sort of like typical guitar nerd stuff, like, are you playing flat wounds? No, I'm playing round wounds. Get that big sound. I was like, oh, okay. And so then I switched back. I switched back to round wounds, and I remember meeting this guitar player that came to town quite a while ago, Wilbert Longmire from the Cincinnati area, and he wanted to try out my guitar. I was like, yeah, sure. And he said too, he's like, yeah, get rid of those flat wounds. I said, yeah, I've been thinking about that. And then I did. So I like my action a little bit higher. But even though this is it's a thinner guitar, it still has like a really big acoustic sound. And if I'm playing in a big band or something, I can still play Freddie Green style, and it cuts pretty well. The one modification I made to it is I put in a better pickup. It's a Seymour Duncan, and people ask me, it's like, why did you put the two-tone color one in there? Wow, that's so different. And it's sometimes like that's the kind that the heavy metal players like to use. I'm not going back to my roots, but so I just like the sound of it. It seems more like sort of like a vintage Gibson pickup, but it's not vintage. But for a while I did play a guitar like Greg's. I played in the mid '90s. I was playing a Gibson Birdland for a while, and when I was touring. But it was a lot to worry about. And then I started touring using cheaper guitars.
Cool. Peter, I wanted to ask you something. All three of you have an incredible capacity to phrase, which is something sometimes sorely lacking in musicians that play electrical instruments like the guitar and the vibraphone. And when I lived in Boston, we used to call some of the guys in Berkeley, like the tenor players that played continually, we called them yubby yubby, because they would play yubby 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 yubby. So it may have been an innate to you, but if not, how did you learn to comp and solo and phrases? And if it was natural to you to be a listener when comping and a soloist to phrase the way you do, could you tell younger players and some veterans about developing this skill of listening and phrasing and comping? And I know that's a large question, but it gives you a lot of room to answer one of the three.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, just listening. Just music is a language, and the way you learn any language is by learning the definitions of words and maybe conjugations of verbs and all that stuff. But basically, it's getting the sound of the language in your ear so that you can speak it convincingly and make yourself understood and understand the way other people. So really, that's the thing about that. Phrasing is really important to me. Listening to the great horn players, not just guitar players for phrasing, but really
right.
Horn players and the great singers. I learned a lot with Marvin Gaye and
because those horn players and singers, they have to breathe. We don't have to breathe between, but maybe it's
exactly.
Yeah.
That's the thing about the guitar. There's no air involved in producing the sound, so we have to we have to make a conscious decision to speak in cadences, and the way we learn, to me, the way to learn that was from the great horn players, who that's where we're learning the language from. As a guitarist, having to comp and really dealing with trying to learn how to comp and getting to that whole side of things, as much as I loved horn players, as a guitar player, we're expected to comp, and it's really my favorite thing to do is just get under and inside the music, underneath the soloist, and it really affected my phrasing the more I got into comping, because as rhythm section players that have to play figures, comping isn't based on linear eighth notes and things like that, subdivisions necessarily. It's based on laying a figure in the pocket. So the more I learned to comp and phrase with comping, I tried to let that carry over into my phrasing in general. It's just about play something that's going to make the beat feel good and move along in the way that you want it. Like that's kind of the idea. So that's what phrasing is. Getting back to what Greg was saying about people like Stanley Turrentine, and it's all about nuance, because there's a certain number of notes we can play on a chord, or things we can play in a chord. But really, and there's a lot of things, of course, put in rhythm and placement and all that, but really the open-ended thing is nuance, and really getting into inflections and really how to render a phrase. And people like Stanley Turrentine, it's not just about the notes on the page, it's about how he plays the phrase. And comping just gets us thinking about not lines, but really.
Yeah, comping is a whole art. I buy books on it, and it helps somewhat, but it just helps to practice a lot on the piano, the comping. But I never
deeper than soloing, I think, in many ways, because unlike soloing, it's a big thing. You invent a story on the spot, right? You're supposed to be like, look at me, this is the thing. But compers are all about like orchestrating an arrangement on the spot, which is kind of more things to do. Compers are orchestrating, and the really great ones are just, you could arrange what they play and it would just lay right in, because it's all voice led and all about the rhythms and the harmonies moving the music forward. Laying pretty stuff on top can be, get away with stuff sometimes. Laying it down, comping, voice leading, no room for like a false move or a false step that doesn't form a link in the chain.
Yeah, I'm often thinking, please leave me a little space, to compers that are over comping. And I've been fooling around with GarageBand and Logic, and I put down a bass line in MIDI, and then the comping, and then all of a sudden I put down the flugelhorn stuff, and I'm realizing the comping doesn't fit at all. It's like a play-along record. You have to have someone reacting to you. And the thing about listening to singers, I mean, I often tell this story. I ruined a record player, a $12 record player, sitting cross-legged, listening to Billie Holiday, especially I Loves You, Porgy. I didn't know that much about music when I was young. I didn't go to college. And when you got to the bridge, da-da-da-da-dee-da-da, it went into the weirdest key. But I would just, that's the best ear training you could make. And phrasing is so important. I tell my students, hey, man, even if you're practicing a solo or what you want to play, take a breath and phrase, even with yourself, you have to have a conversation. I could pick up the flugelhorn or a muted trumpet and play without anyone, without any accompaniment, and still phrase and try to make it sound like I'm telling a sentence, I'm making a phrase, and you could think about this for a minute, and then I'm going to answer it or come up with something new. And I think what you said about listening to singers is super important. Greg, I wanted to ask you a question. You worked with one of my favorite singers, Marty Elkins, doing Fuse Blues, and I had Marty on the show earlier in the session, and on that record was Herb Pomeroy, Houston Pearson, my friend Tardo Hammer, R.I.P. Dennis Irwin, God rest his soul, and Mark Taylor. Sometimes it's nice having piano with the guitar because it gives you a little more space. I love working with singers, by the way. I got to work with Sinatra 5 years, and Tony Bennett a couple times, and James Taylor, and Bill Murray singing New York, New York, which was really cool. Do you prefer trio to quintet to working with singers, or do you have an equal love for working with singers and just in your own group?
As far as having a piano player there as well?
No, as far as working with singers or working with your own band or with a quintet or a trio. Working with singers as opposed to working with an instrumental band. What could you say about that?
The thing about that I like about working with vocalists, like I worked with Ruth Brown for a number of years, and then I worked with Gloria Lynn for a few years too. Is that's gonna you have to learn how to comp to do that.
Yeah,
because you can't be
sure.
stepping all over them. You have to make a little bit of, make a statement maybe, so they know you're there, but maybe not, distract them and don't get in the way of the piano player when there's usually a piano player. Sometimes you have to, take your territory and be careful about it.
Cool.
I can't remember what the question was.
Well, it was mostly about the working with singers and if you enjoyed them equally, and also you answered the question about how you think differently. I think when you're comping behind a singer, you might have to listen a little differently. For instance, I won't go into tritone substitutions when I'm backing up a singer as much. I won't be as experimental. I'm
Right.
Even more so than, well, way more so if I was soloing in my own band.
Yeah.
So I guess you're comping way differently behind a singer than you would behind
pretty
Stanley.
Yeah, a lot of times very spare. But yeah, it depends. You have to just. A lot of times you have to defer to the pianist. I find that works with vocalists, because a lot of vocalists, I think vocalists a lot of them are more comfortable with a piano player rather than just guitar. Although Gloria would do a song with just guitar, but I think they're used to that bigger sound of the piano. Hey, there was one thing I wanted to say about the phrasing and the breathing thing. It reminded me when Peter was talking about that earlier, that I was doing a rehearsal for a record date of my own, and it was with Ralph Peterson on drums, who also plays trumpet, and we rehearsed a song. We were rehearsing a song of mine, and he said, "Boy, you can tell a horn player didn't write this song." I just kind of thought about it for a minute, because there was no place to breathe. And I think he thinks like that because his first instrument was trumpet.
Yeah, about the whole composing thing, I was lucky to study with Bob Brookmeyer and Manny Album for 2 BMI sessions, and Bob told me to try to write on the piano. And sometimes something just comes out of the trumpet or the flugelhorn that is simple, that like just feels right. And then sometimes I'll sit at the piano and just compose, and it'll take me a few days. I've even taken a bridge to a song and put it away for like 2 years and then brought it back. And there's different types of writing and composing, which brings me to a question for Bob. There's so many great arrangers and teachers in Rochester, such as Bill Dobbins, who wrote jazz arranging and composing, a linear approach, which I own, and Rayburn Wright, who wrote Inside the Score, showing the scores of Thad Jones, Sammy Nestico, and Bob Brookmeyer, 2 essential books, I think, for new arrangers and composers. Bob, did knowing these 2 affect your playing and writing, or that of your students?
Yeah, I mean, Bill is still at school. He's still teaching, and he's a marvelous pianist that I'd love to play with as well. I kind of missed out on being able to work with Ray directly, because he was out on medical leave, sadly, when I got to Rochester, and then he passed away soon after. But being able to study with Bill, I remember one of my improv classes that I had with Bill before I had him for composition class. Great pianist Tamir Hendelman was in the improv class with me, and we just be listening Bill, trying to hang on every word he was saying about, how to sequence on the diminished and, using diminished extensions against dominant chords and different things. And it's all those kinds of things that stuck with me. Just the same as like the really old school guitar things that my teacher taught me about George Van Epps and and Charlie Christian and Barney Kessel, all that stuff carried over. And then just, learning what Bill was teaching still has an impact on my teaching. And I try to feel like everything that you learn from every teacher, like your students are the students of your teacher as well, because it's like that tree that just keeps giving. And that's I'm grateful for having had amazing teachers that fill my my brain with so many good ideas. And I think one of the things that Bill helped me out with a lot when I was in college too was the idea, which you were talking about, phrasing too. It's if you don't leave any space and you don't learn how to voice lead with all these cool chords that we might know that work well for certain situations, and we can get too complex and too notey to actually play music. So it was very, very helpful. Yeah, those are things I try to help my students with too, is to make sure that they're using sound voice leading and they're using good phrasing, because the guitar is one of those instruments that it's evolved technically, where you get kids who are 13, 14 years old that are playing 3 times as fast as I ever could. But then you look at the music and you think, like, well, what if Hank Mobley played his ideas 3 times as fast as he was playing them? Would they feel the same way? No, it's, these things, it's not always right for the moment. And the complexity of the music doesn't necessarily make jazz better. That's those are some things I've picked up from my teachers, and it's sort of helped me to edit my own playing so I don't really throw away notes.
So I want to read some of the comments here from our fans online. I'm very fortunate to be able to get them live. And somebody said about your teacher, he played with Jimmy Luncifer. That is true. That's about Bob's teacher.
Yeah. He didn't play with Jimmy very often. There was another rhythm guitar player on Jimmy's band, Al Norris, and so he was Al's regular sub. But he said he loved Lunsford's band so much.
Did he work with? I looked up his online. Chet Crowley, I think the name is, and did he work with Chet Baker? I don't think so. I don't know why that name came up, but they had no guitar on the tracks that I listened to. But I did listen to some of the Jimmy Luncifer stuff. Jesus, the arranging is just beautiful. Also, my friend Saudi Zane says he hears no, I hear the same interference. So there is some kind of sound going. And then Gil Paris says it sounds good here, and I'm at the Music Conservatory of Westchester. Jim Coleman says, you're perfect, Richie. Sneider sounds good. Peter is slightly weak and breaking up a little. Jim Coleman says Peter sounds good. Again, from Craig McCullen, we can deal with it just like old school international call. Yeah. Dominic Laprisi says Romano and Lewis Hayes. Yes. I'm hearing all the references to Rochester. What a great watershed place to grow up as a musician is from Mark Yanchich. Craig McCullen says Stanley Turrentine, hope we can be together soon. Dave D'Angelo.
Played on that record of Sammy's.
Dave D'Angelo says, great show, Richie. Greetings to both Bob and Peter. Hope we can meet someday. Hello to Greg. It's been a long time. Peter Roos, my friend, I met from Sibelius and online help, says cheers. Christopher Nome says jazz mans. Now this brings me to something for Peter. Peter, you have a couple of children and I presume a wife. Does that affect the time you practice? And is it grounding for you? It seems like it would actually, and sometimes help the whole music thing. For me, I'm a little selfish with my time, and I like to have that alone time. Like I'm thinking, wow, I'm like I'm so good with kids, but I could give them back. People say, hey, you'd make a great dad. And then I get home and I go, geez, what's that sound? And I go, oh, that's silence. And I could like watch Netflix or come home at 3 a.m. and walk around in my underwear and all kinds of stuff. But particularly you and Bob seem very happy, and you own a beautiful dog, and you have kids. Has that helped you in some ways? That's more of a personal question, but would be interesting to me.
That's yes. I mean, I can't. I mean, that's a big part of my life, and music is a part of my life too. Of course, if I didn't have other things taking my time, I would spend a lot more time practicing. But I also think have a life give you things to play music about and make your life full. It is what it is. I mean, I
It's like I have a cousin.
Road.
I have a cousin that told me you have to practice your relationships, not just chord relationships.
Exactly.
Well, I think it is an important part of your life, and I seem to fill it in other ways. I donate my time to help put people in kayaks, and I help with autistic kids on horses in Forest Hills, and I just joined Animal Haven because I said, and people say, hey, Richie, you're a good guy. And I say, yeah, but you have 2 kids. I mean, you're really good. So also I wanted to ask you, Peter, about your own composition and how you come about that. How did you learn to compose songs and write, and what moved you in that direction?
Well, I always wrote as far back as I can remember, especially when I started learning more about harmony, checking out jazz, different kinds of harmony. I would always try to write tunes to get to hear these sounds that were I was being exposed to. So I tried to organize the sounds that I was hearing in my head and being taught, learning about, organize them into songs. So I've come to just enjoy the process of, well, I can't say enjoy because sometimes it's quite frustrating, but just the feeling of taking an idea and trying to mold it into something that's not just a series of things to play, but what makes something a composition is fascinating to me, and enjoy the thing of just kind of getting an idea and living with it for a while, or maybe it comes out really quickly and it's finished, and then you go back to it and you write a bunch of stuff and you cut that out and you stick with the original thing. It can happen all kinds of ways. Sometimes you have to step away from it and come back and you see what to add to it and where to go. It's important to me, not just because it's on a small scale, giving birth to something. Say, I made this thing, whatever it is, and it's also the process of choosing, making choices, deciding how a phrase is developed, how an idea is developed. This affects me when I go to improvise and play, jazz, where we're thinking on our feet, and you take a solo on a form that maybe is familiar to you, maybe not, but you take a solo and you try to compose on the spot. You try to spontaneously weave the story that has some kind of structure and balance. So composition to me is taking that process and slowing it down as low as you want it to go until you.
That's exactly what I tell people. I tell them that composing, which has become so important to me, composing and arranging, I learned from being in, well, not only Brooke Myers and Manny album, but in studying books like Bill Dobbin's book and Inside the Score, but from doing it. And I tell students that composing to me is like improvising very slowly. So that's a very good description, Peter. Greg, you moved here from Wichita to New York. What prompted your move from Wichita, by the way?
Because all the players that I liked, most of them, because New York was the jazz
capital.
Yeah, I think it really was, yeah.
And when you moved here, who were the cats that you are talking about? Because it was a while ago, and some of them are not with us anymore.
I remember I went to there was someplace Cedar Walton was playing, and I had these Cedar Walton was playing, and in Wichita, I had these Cedar Walton records. There was a series, or a couple of them, that were called Eastern Rebellion. And it was Cedar Walton with Billy Higgins and Sam Jones. And I remember going to a gig when I first got here, and those three were playing at the gig, and I was just blown away. Like it's hard to describe.
Sam was a giant. He was one of those bass players who didn't solo a lot. We were talking about, but when he did, it was super special. Great player. Yeah. I saw him in Rochester, actually. I met so many great musicians in Rochester. I saw Dizzy Gillespie, Gene Ammons, the Buddy Rich Big Band, Maynard Ferguson, James Moody with Sam Jones, and just fantastic clubs in Rochester. Anyways, we've been on for an hour and 10 minutes, gentlemen. And it was so interesting talking to you, because I know so little about guitar. And when I write for it, it's like I'm writing for usually 3 notes instead of a whole piano. But you guys make it sound like an orchestra. So
just think of it like you're writing for a ukulele, and then you can be pleasantly surprised.
There you go. Well, I'll try that. But I want to thank you all for watching our show today. And I'd like to thank our guests, Greg Skaff, Bob Sneider, and Peter Bernstein. Most of all, our fans, for taking the time out of their lives to watch today's show. Next week, I'm running on a wing and a prayer. I hope to have comedians. It would be the social distancing comedian show with any luck. And it would be Barry Weintraub, Howard Fellow, and Wanda Hanson. I actually have to call them and hook this up, and they kind of know about it. So because it might be X-rated, if you have children between 3 and 31, the material might not be appropriate for them. So, folks, thank you for watching. And once again, I'd like to thank these 3 magnificent guests, Peter, Bob, and Greg, for participating. Stay safe, stay inside, save lives. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Richie.
All right.
Thanks, Rich.
Okay, guys. Thanks.
Later.
Yeah.